Hi, welcome to Classics You Slept Through. I'm Kyle Davis, along with a girl who has never spent 4 days wearing down a moose. It is my sister, Meredith. Hey, Mer, how's it going today?
Hey, I have spent a lot of days, though, at Civil War reenactments wearing wool stockings and in porta potties, so that's brutal. Does that count?
Similar Yukon conditions, I suppose.
Yukon conditions. Gettysburg in July? Not Yukon conditions.
Not quite. So if you're joining us for the first time, what we do on this podcast is we take classic books, we break them down for you, and make them unintimidating. Today we're finishing up Call of the Wild by Jack London. Starting off here in Chapter 5, Buck and the team are pretty worn down. They have been doing a lot of running, a lot of carrying for the Scotch half-breed who's now leading the team. And as London points out to us, dogs that can't pull their weight on the trail are kind of worthless.
And they need rest. They need rest badly to be worth anything. Because they can't pull their weight and they can't pull the weight of the sled, and they aren't going to get that rest. They do not get that rest.
And they don't just need rest. They don't just need a night off. They need like an off season to recoup, basically. That's how bone weary and worn down these dogs are. So since they are no longer good for the trail, the Scotch half-breed decides to sell them. And here we are introduced to our human characters of Chapter 5, Hal and Charles's wife, Mercedes. I guess they end up being as close to villains as you get in this story.
Them, yeah, aside from the man in the red sweater.
I don't know if he's so much villainous as he is a product of the system that he operates in. He fulfills a function.
Such sympathy for the man with the club.
Well, these guys, more so than Charles and Hal, these guys don't really fulfill much of a function in the system. So who are Charles, Hal, and Mercedes, Mare?
Well, they are youngsters, so to speak. They are like early 20s, and they are fully caught up in this madness or gold rush craze. And they've set out to, I guess, make their fortune running dog sleds. And Charles and Mercedes are brother and sister, and Hal and Mercedes are married. And I hope I've got that relationship right. If I don't, flip it, reverse it, fix it. But I think that's right. Charles and Mercedes are brother and sister. No, she's Charles's wife. Hal is her brother.
I was going to say, Charles and Mercedes are married.
Charles and Mercedes are married, yeah.
The young guy.
Regardless, there is a familial connection, and they are, dare I say, woefully, disgustingly unprepared for this trip.
Most definitely. Most definitely. I found it interesting how, and I'm wondering how accessible this was to readers at the time, even how London, or even how accessible it was to readers who have no Yukon experience, because Hal is described as wearing a belt with a knife, a large Colt revolver, cartridges all over the belt, and London explicitly says that this belt was a symbol of his callowness, his inexperience in the Yukon. So I'm assuming he's just ostentatiously dressed in his mental picture of what I suppose a gold prospector. Honestly, their motivations aren't ever really addressed, why they're undergoing this trek. I think it's left to us to assume it's part of the gold boom, and they're up there to make their fortune, as you said. But I found it interesting that the way they were dressed marked them out to the other people in the area, whereas to me, it wasn't blatantly obvious that him wearing a belt with a knife and a revolver on it said, okay, this guy's a greenhorn. He doesn't know what he's doing.
I picture everybody else with, well, they're woefully unprepared because they are, in a sense, overly prepared because they've loaded their sled with dishes and tents, and Mercedes got a bunch of clothes and all kinds of stuff that they don't need. It's too much to carry for them and for the dogs. They don't take care of it. They eventually do have to discard it. So I'm thinking, likewise, he doesn't need a gun and all of those cartridges. He just needs to be, or at least the trail savvy people like Thornton, once we meet him, they've got a knife or an axe or a pistol, like something light, portable that they can wield really, really well. And so they don't need all of that Rambo gear that he's wearing.
And Buck picks up on this as well. He mentions that he sees how disordered their camp is. Their tents aren't tight. They have dirty dishes. And horror upon horror, they have a woman in the Yukon.
Well, and she, not just that she's a woman, but she serves no purpose other than to be there and be with them. She doesn't help. She doesn't do anything. She insists on riding on the sleigh. Or, the sled. I guess it's not a sleigh. It's not like Santa's going up there prospecting.
Not a sledge.
But she doesn't, it's not like she's isn't there a frontier woman? Like Annie?
Like an Annie Oakley type?
Yeah, that's not her.
No, definitely not. So Buck instantly picks up on the disorder of the camp. And at this point, Hal and Charles are starting to break camp and get things packed up so they can get moving with Buck and the team that they've purchased. And this brings us into a scene where some hecklers gather and watch them. There's a lot of disorder as they're packing up. They lighten their load, and still the hecklers are pointing out that their load's still too heavy. These dogs aren't going to be able to carry it. And so Hal and Charles go and purchase 6 more dogs who apparently are not huskies, that are just sort of random. There was a Newfoundland and some other breeds in there, but they were not large working dogs suited for the Arctic.
No.
And despite all this, London mentions that they were quite pleased. They had not seen a 14-dog team anywhere in the Yukon, and these guys were pleased as punch that they now had a 14-dog team.
I think there's a reason they didn't see a 14-dog team. Same reason they didn't see dishes or tents or people wearing Rambo belts. Too much is too much with these people.
You get into weight concerns here. You have these dogs pulling this weight. These dogs have to be able to pull the weight. And the amount of food you would need for a 14-dog team is too much for you to carry. So there's all these calculations that these guys are definitely not doing, and they're not picking up on anything around them. So the fact that they had not seen a 14-dog team, it didn't seem strange to them that they were now getting 14 dogs.
And I like to picture Mercedes in all of this because it says she cried over every single discarded thing. You picture her like sitting on the ground, which I assume is covered with snow. She's rocking back and forth with her knees up to her chest with her hands clasped, and she's brokenheartedly crying. And she said she's not going to move an inch. She's just very, she's like a little toddler.
Throughout
this heavy toddler.
Yeah, throughout this whole chapter, I was very curious as to what motivated Mercedes to actually embark on this journey with the two men. Right. London doesn't do a great job of developing characters very much. It's no. This is a very short book. We get, they're more cardboard cutouts than they are actual people. But why he's using them to illustrate a point, but why she would ever agree to this. And why, once they set out, why she would agree to continue, I don't understand.
I'm guessing I was always picturing her newlywed to Charles, and so hey, I'm going to set off with your brother for months at a time, and perhaps she's just like, well, I want to go. I can go, and she perhaps pictures herself more of an Annie Oakley than she is.
She definitely does not turn out to be. So our intrepid humans set out with a sled that's too heavy, with too many provisions, with tired out dogs, and with a mismatched team that aren't even trail dogs. At the start of this chapter, Buck and company were already bone weary, and now this heavy load is wearing them down even further. We're going to add to that the complete mismanagement that Hal and Charles do with the rationing. At first, well, we've already established that you can't carry enough food to manage a 14-dog team. And then, as the dogs are not performing to the standard they had calculated. They overfeed the dogs, which burns through their rations even quicker, until the point where they realize they've done that, and now they're cutting the rations even half of what they had before. So complete mismanagement all around, and eventually the new dogs just die. London makes a comment that a regular dog would die on a sled dog's ration, and now they're being cut to half rations. So these Southland dogs that are not buck can't hack it. So
and he makes a distinction. He makes a distinction too with huskies. The huskies in general, buck not included. Buck is obviously, he's cut from a different cloth, and he's special because he's buck. But huskies themselves are built for this, and they can sustain this. And the Newfoundland and these other various breeds that they've got with them, there's no way that they can survive. They're not built for it in any way whatsoever.
Right. So they eventually run out of food, and they're not making much time. And I don't know if we want to dig into this, but then we get to what I think is the quintessential London opinion of women scene, where Mercedes throws her temper tantrum and sits down on the ground and refuses to move.
They travel, 3 miles?
3 miles. So we've already established that they're struggling to make 10 in a day. So she's sitting on the snow immobile for 3 miles. That's got to be a good 4 to 5 hours that she sits there to make those 3 miles while the men are making those 3 miles. Then they turn around and come back for her. So she's probably there a good 8 hours just sitting on the snow being petulant.
She's got an inner strength that she is not displaying in other realms of her life, apparently, because that's...
Most certainly.
She doesn't even walk towards them. She just sits there.
She just sits there for hours upon hours.
What if they just left her there? She would die. She would literally die.
She would have. London makes clear that the whole reason that she's bringing them down, that she's contributing nothing to this expedition, is because she is a woman.
She makes that clear, or oh, I see. Mercedes nursed a special grievance, the grievance of sex. She was pretty and soft, and had been chivalrously treated all her days. It's not her fault, right? She is also a product.
She's a product of her time.
Yeah. It was her custom to be helpless.
Which then, again, brings up, why would she ever want to go on this journey? But that's neither here nor there. So they run out of food, and they're forced to trade away Hal's beautiful colt for some horsehide, which they then feed to the dogs. Apparently they feed it to them hair and all.
Yeah, and it has no nutritional value.
No nutritional value, tough and leathery and hairy in their stomachs. And they continue to beat the dogs in order to make them move.
And we see our good Billy. Billy dies.
Billy dies. Yeah. We're losing dogs here left and right.
Yeah.
But then we finally find Harrison Ford.
John Thornton.
Who
I think Harrison Ford is well cast. I've known John Thornton long before Harrison Ford ever played John Thornton, and I think, well done, casting director.
We need an old grizzled man.
Yeah, he's a good fit. And I love when we meet John Thornton, because it doesn't quite seem like he matters much, other than he gets a first and last name. He's like the onlookers we see before they leave. The onlookers in the beginning of the chapter, they're giving them advice. They're saying, throw away this stuff. Don't do it this way. And they've ignored all of the advice and have gotten, as John Thornton says, fool's luck. And he's like, yeah, well, I still wouldn't do the thing that you want to do, which is cross over this ice that's melting. Because they say the bottom of the trail is going to drop out. And they're like, we've overcome all of the things that people said we shouldn't do, and here we are. People didn't think we'd make it here. And he's like, yeah, well, you should stop.
You're still out of your skis here.
Yeah.
I found it fascinating. I mean, I don't want to I don't want to get too political on this podcast, but, it's very much like our current president who believes that they're in this position, they've made it this far through their sheer skill and ability, when really it's quite the opposite. So Hal and Charles and Mercedes have made it there, and they attribute their arriving, as far as they have, to their skill or their handling of the trail. But I found it interesting that I can kind of forgive them somewhat for setting out on the journey and not listening to the old hands on the trail. They had this overconfidence. They thought they could do it. Once they've reached Thornton's camp, however, they've been through a good bit of starvation on the trail and difficulties. And, the Hal and Charles had at least planned out what they thought they should be traveling, the rate they should be traveling. So they were aware they weren't making the amount of distance that they had planned. They had half of their team die already because they lost the extra dogs they had purchased. They've traded away their gun for horsehide because their rations are expended. And yet they still do not take Thornton's advice. They still believe that they're going to continue on and make it.
It's probably because they have had this little bit of luck that says, it's been tough, but we have made it this far. No one thought I could do this. And here I am. Here we are at Dawson. We're beating the odds. And that little bit of, I don't know, that little bit of dopamine that gets released when you get an accomplishment or something. They think, maybe it'll all be over if we just make it. If we just keep going.
Just keep going.
And our luck's not run out yet. We can make it. I'll just beat this dog till he stands up.
Which is the only way they've gotten the dogs to move to this point. But once they've reached Thornton's camp, Buck says no more. He's done. He's sensed something. He sensed disaster on the horizon and just does not get up.
And I don't know if he sensed... I think London would have us believe, at least from the way the book's been written thus far, is that Buck's sensed the thing that does happen, which the bottom of the trail drops out.
Right.
They all fall into the ice. Everybody dies. Right. But maybe that's not what he senses. I would think that Buck perhaps senses his own impending doom. He is so exhausted that if he keeps going, to use the metaphor, the bottom of his own trail could drop out and he would be dead. And he doesn't even care that he's being beaten so relatively mercilessly that he starts to, I feel like he starts to go towards the light. Like he doesn't feel it anymore. Right. He just starts to let go. And that could be, he's like, this is going to happen to me one way or another. That's what I feel like. Happen. Yeah.
He's done moving. Well, he's so savagely beaten that this finally spurs John Thornton to action. And he cuts Buck out of the harness and threatens Hal, wraps his knuckles with the axe handle he's been carving and sends them on their way. And they're within eyesight. So within a short distance upon leaving John Thornton, the bottom of the trail does fall out. The ice cracks. And that's it for the rest of the dogs and the 3 humans who we've been following this chapter.
Which Thornton doesn't, there's no mention of and then Thornton started to go help them or made a move towards, no. He's like,
they just watched him fall. Not much he could do.
Yeah. Everybody's gone.
So that brings us to the end of chapter 5. And so now our new human interlocutor with Buck is John Thornton.
Yeah. And he doesn't show up till the very end of the book, but he is now the focus of Buck's life. Because Thornton helps Buck recover, nurses him back to health. And this is the first time Buck's ever experienced actual love and care, because Thornton doesn't treat him like a business partner or like someone he's got to, it says the different relationships he's had throughout his life, with the kids on the farm or in California, he watched them and was their overseer or their caretaker. With the judge, he was just like a partner when he went out hunting with the judge's older kids or whoever it was, again, it was a partnership of sorts. This is an actual loving, caring, even uses the word passionate love relationship that they've got. And then he has doggy friends too. He's got Skeet and Nidge that he's now friends with, and they play games. And this is the first time Buck gets to be, I guess, just a dog.
Right.
Like, he doesn't have a job necessarily right now.
Right. So that's a good point. Buck's kind of got two things working here. One, he has that, I forget what the actual terminology is for it, but that, when a soldier's in the hospital and he falls in love with his nurse because they brought him back to health or whatever, that phenomenon. So Buck has that going on with John Thornton. John saved his life. So now Buck has this affection towards him. But also, this is the first time where Buck really has no job. Back on the judge's place, he didn't really have a job, but he was the alpha. He kind of had the responsibility. He had the pressure of maintaining his position. And then once he was on the trail, he had that same thing. He didn't want Spitz to overtake him. He didn't want to he wanted to be the lead dog. He had something to work towards. And he had the human handlers, be it, Perot and Francois or the other mail carriers. They had a mission and they were working and he was a tool. Here with John Thornton, he simply is existing. John's not doing anything. John's not working. John is simply recouping himself while his partners are off, getting supplies for their future expedition, as we'll see. But when we first meet John, he's just camping. He's literally just doing nothing.
Buck is terrified, actually, that John will leave him because all the other humans have left him in some way. And so he keeps a very watchful eye. He knows every move John makes, and he's never far from him. And he's so hopelessly devoted to him. John knows it. I like and I hate the scene where once Hans and Pete come back, John wants to prove Buck's devotion to him. And he's like, hey, watch this. And they're sitting on the edge of a freaking cliff. And he's like, hey, Buck, jump. And Buck's like, okay. And he just launches himself off the cliff. And Thornton has to catch him. And then Hans and Pete have to drag them all back from the edge. But it is a precursor because Pete says, I wouldn't want to be the person who gets in between you and Buck or who threatens you in some way because of this undying devotion. And Thornton says, it's splendid and it's terrible. And sometimes it makes me afraid.
A little brief foreshadowing there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we get to see that faithfulness in a couple of scenes. So once Hans and Pete get back, they do get back to working whatever it is that they're doing with the rafts up and down the river for a bit. They're in town. They're at, I guess, a bar or a saloon. And Thornton good-naturedly steps in between two people to defend someone who's being bullied by this guy Burton.
Not unlike what he did with Buck and Hal.
Right. And Burton comes off and punches Thornton, I think, in the shoulder. And that's it. Buck gets up, launches himself straight for his neck. Not even a warning, not a leg, not an arm, straight for his neck. Burton blocks it by throwing his forearm up. Buck comes back in, slashes his throat. It takes all the people to rip Buck off of him. They have a meeting and decide that Buck had clear reason to attack this man. And so Buck is left unpunished. But it's a clear sign of what Buck is capable of and what he wants to do to defend Thornton at all costs.
Right.
My dog would not do that for me.
I find so that scene I find interesting that we get a little taste of, frontier justice where they call the council and they just kind of all decide, man, dog was right.
A
guy was
miners'
wrong.
meeting.
He started it off.
And he develops this reputation now.
Right.
It said it spread through every camp in Alaska that this dog, Buck, this is what he's capable of and this is what he does. And it only grows from here on out, that reputation for now until the end of the book.
Right. So this chapter also starts off something that it's alluded to in the earlier chapters. You know, the title of the book is The Call of the Wild.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen Buck sort of adapting to the wild and his wild nature surfacing throughout the book. This is the first chapter where Buck explicitly hears the call, and it's a manifested thing that is pulling him. And the only thing that's really tethering him to answering it is now this newfound love of a human. So John Thornton is sort of keeping him civilized, even though he has this draw out to the call.
We discussed in the last episode, our last discussion, I should say, where London has some turns of phrases that can be a little redundant. And it's like a little heavy-handed. We get it. The law of club and fang, and you say it 4 times in the chapter. But he also has some really beautiful passages. And to your point, I love that in talking about this actual call and being connected to the past, London writes about Buck that he was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked with the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he swayed as the tides and seasons swayed. I just think that's so cool. He was older than the days he had seen. And it's this living memory or this existing tide of some sort of life force. I don't know.
It's a hard life too. I mean, when you see someone that's worked a hard life, they look far older than what they are aged. One of my favorite things is to look at pictures of athletes from like the 1960s, and you see these guys, they look like they're 55, and you're like, oh, this guy was like 28 when he was playing pro ball, but he looks ancient. Men just looked older back in those days. I think because they just lived a rougher life. We have a lot of modern conveniences.
So you're going literally, like Buck's lived a hard life and he's actually older than he should be versus
I think you can read it both ways. I mean, I think there's an element of both. I think London is trying to connect Buck to a line of ancestors, through the wildness, but Buck also has, you think about had he lived, we're talking Buck's been working a year maybe in the Yukon. I mean, it's not that long.
Yeah.
So had he stayed on the farm, he would have only aged a year, whereas he's lived multiple lifetimes, and seen death and watched the other dogs come and go and live and die, and he's survived it all.
I feel like 2020 has been that way so far, and it's only April 14th.
Seriously, it's 4 years in one.
Oh my God.
I don't even remember, like, a month ago. It was like early March. Like, doesn't even seem
it was a different life. It was
totally different
quarantine.
Oh, anyway. So then we get into just another illustration.
Can I sit down on the trail and not move? I'm not moving.
Just another illustration of, last time we talked about Buck's quick learning. John falls in the river. The boat he's on capsizes, and Buck has to save him. Takes Buck a few attempts, but Buck quickly figures out how the current is going and is able to rescue John. So Buck's loyalty is demonstrated here, as well as just his intelligence.
And it's brutal, though. The attempt, the rapids are terribly strong, and it's either Pete or Hal's fault that the boat capsizes, because snubbing, I guess, is like pulling something back into shore or around, and so he pulls the boat too hard, and it flips. Tips. John goes under. Of course, Buck jumps in to save him, but it doesn't work the first time. He tries his hardest, but then finally Thornton realizes what's going to happen, and so he's like, I'm just going to cling to this rock. Go, Buck. Go for the shore. That's your best chance. I'll hold on here. Then Hal and Pete tie the rope to his collar so that it doesn't choke him and that it doesn't impede his swimming. But when they pull him back in, they yank him and pull him under the water, and they basically almost drown him twice. Yeah. But he keeps going, and eventually, of course, Buck saves Thornton again, and they stay, they hang out, and they set up camp for Thornton to recover.
Right. He has some broken bones, and so they're just hanging out by the river for a couple of weeks. So these guys are really not in any particular hurry. They don't have, as we mentioned, they don't have the pressure of the Canadian government's, mail and official orders getting through. They're just like, okay, well, hey, John, you broke your arm. I guess we'll just hang out here for a couple of weeks.
But they do have to make money. They do have debts, right? Which is the final scene.
They are grub-staked, which... Grub-staked, yes. So I looked that one up. So that is basically they have an investor somewhere who has fronted them some cash for this expedition.
Interesting. So, listeners, if you have to look up a lot of words when you're reading, so do we.
Exactly. So when it says they're grub-staked, that's someone has fronted them some cash, and they have debts. But once again, Buck's going to come through, and we're gonna take care of those debts pretty well.
Yeah, everyone's bragging about their dogs on the trail. I guess that's what you can brag about in this. I'm assuming everybody's hungry and poor and cold. What do they have?
You have dogs.
They have these dogs that work for them. So, my dog can pull 700 pounds. My dog can pull this from a dead standstill. And Thornton believes in Buck to the point that he says something almost foolish, and he says he could pull 1,000 pounds and start it too, meaning no help. The sled's not being pushed. Buck has to do it all on his own. And they call him on it. And he's like, well, shit then. I need to borrow some money.
I need to front some cash here. Yeah.
And then
Hans and Pete, and he can
really
only scrape
worried.
up a few hundred. So
yeah,
somebody else gives him some money to actually cover the wager. So this is
Matthew
a wager
Stern,
that Buck can, from a dead frozen stop, break out a sled of 1,000 pounds and then pull it 100 yards by himself.
He did it.
And he does it.
He did it. And I looked up some of the commands, the gi and haw, which means left and right. And I'm not sure if that's exactly respectively or not. But there was some debate on whether break it out meant, oh, you just have to pull it, but we'll break the ice off for you. So then you can start it. Or do you have to break the ice and pull it from a dead standstill? So they had a little meeting again and decided, no, he has to break the ice too.
So,
and he does 1,000 pounds.
1,000 pounds, and ends up that John picks up $1,600 from this little venture.
And did you do the math on that?
Of course, I did the math on that. That $1,600 works out to $49,865. So that's almost $50,000 that John gets for Buck pulling this sled some distance.
Woo!
You ask me, I think they should just give up the gold prospecting and just go to the different camps and make some money off of Buck pulling sleds, but make some wagers.
Phew, that's a lot of money.
That is.
I mean, $1,600 still feels like a lot of money. If I hook Clank up to something and he pulled it and I got $1,600,
I'd take $1,600. Sure.
That's amazing. And he gets offers before Buck does anything. Buck is such a beautiful creature that someone offers him $800. Buck doesn't even have to do anything. Right. He just looks at him and he wants him. And then at the end of it, he offers him $1,200. And I could, that last part, the last dialogue in this chapter, I could totally hear Harrison Ford's voice. I hope that line is in the actual movie. When he tells him, "You can go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir."
Well, as we'll see here in Chapter 7, even though that would have been a lot of money for a dog, if Buck pulls his weight, they're going to do quite all right once they get to where they're going.
They find plenty of gold. It makes it sound like gold is just like flowing down the rivers and they just have to catch it.
Well, they've heard these rumors of this secret mine here in Chapter 7, and they decide they're going to find it.
Yeah, it's like a snow pirates or something, like looking for buried mine treasure. So
this is a much different lifestyle that Buck is living now with the men and the other two dogs. They're living on. They don't carry rations with them. They don't have anywhere to be or any time constraints. So they're living off the land. They're just hunting daily for their food, just taking a leisurely pace, trying to find where they go. So they can, if they want to stop for a few days, they can stop for a few days. If they want to keep moving, they can keep moving. And so this is definitely good for Buck. Buck's been fighting this call of the wild, but now they're out in the wild. I mean, before, even though Buck felt some sort of tug, he's moving between settlements. He's on a regular mail route. He's going to different camps. Once we leave wherever they were when they took the bet, they're out in the true wild. I mean, civilization is gone. They are blazing their own trails. They are finding old empty trails and ruins of folks that have been through cabins before. They come across an old cabin that some rotting blankets and a rifle they find.
They spend 3 seasons, I think it is, summer through winter, traveling over this fully wild terrain. And then in the spring is where they come to that valley where it seems like there's just gold flowing through the rivers.
London says that they are making thousands, that's multiple thousands a day. So
like sacks of 50 pounds of nuggets and dust.
So if we have established that $1,000 is like 30 grand, I mean, they're making multiples of that a day. I mean, they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars daily.
Well, who's coming to get it, and what are they going to do with it? Because it just says they're making it, but they're out here doing that, and it doesn't say they have plans. I guess the logical conclusion is that they'll eventually take it back.
Eventually, they'll take it and sell it. I suppose
when they feel like going back,
right?
Yeah.
So at this point, it's like a game of press your luck. It's how long do we want to stay out here prospecting before we take it back to camp and sell it? As we'll find, maybe they miscalculated on that one.
But this affords Buck plenty of time to literally now do what he wants. As the men are busy panning for gold and the dogs are just laying around, he can heed the call when he feels like it, and he does.
He will go out for days at a time and just range around and then come back when he feels like it. So this was something I found interesting. He starts dreaming of the hairy man, which I didn't quite understand who the hairy man was. I mean, I'm assuming, is he meaning a wolf?
They're cavemen.
Or is he?
No, he's dreaming of cavemen. Yeah, he was having, at the end of our last discussion, you'll remember, Kyle.
Of course I remember.
I talked about how, I think it's in chapter 2, he sits around the fire and it's either 2 or 4. He sits around the fire and he has these visions of the past, and he sees a hairy man with a stooped back and long arms who, just hunts and is very agile, yet, is clearly I don't know if it's okay to call it the stereotype
Neanderthal
of a caveman.
Yeah, caveman.
Yeah. And he keeps that I guess that's the call of the wild. He's having these actual visions in his mind of the primitive past, and what it would be like to sit around that fire, the fires that connect us all back at the beginning of time, which was what I mentioned at the end of the last episode.
Right.
But these visions now continue, and the call is so strong.
He has a lot of leisure time at this point to be listening to this call. Yeah. He's not working. It mentions the only thing he really does is if John kills something, he'll help him haul in the meat. Other than that, Buck's just kind of on his own. And, idle hands are the devil's plaything, as they say. So this is definitely... Buck's going to get in trouble now.
It seems like he's going to anyway. He meets a timber wolf, and he feels some sort of... And it's a small timber wolf because Buck is bigger than him, and they run off. The wolf tries to tell him to go away, but Buck pursues him and wins, and finally they sniff noses and run forever. But he continually, as much as the call of the wild is pulling Buck, and he wants to frolic and kill and eat meat that he finds on his own and be with this wolf, he can always find his way back to camp, and he's always called back by Thornton.
Right.
Or at least his love for Thornton. And then he'll spend like 2 days just staring at him.
Right.
Lovingly. And then he'll go off again.
There's definitely 2 Bucks at this point. When he gets back to camp, he acts like a dog.
That's a good point.
And when he goes out into the wild, he acts like a wolf. I mean, he kills a bear, which is a fairly sizable animal. and then defends the carcass for a few days while he eats it. And it mentions how much he loves that feeling of killing at this point. So he definitely has that wild nature, but then he goes back to camp and he likes getting pet and hanging out with John for a little bit.
Yeah, and he does kill to eat. So he eats what he kills. Obviously, he can't alone eat a full bear. So it's a little unnecessary to kill a bear.
Well, it takes a few days. But he's also enjoying it. It's fun for him. And despite the bear kill, he wants something more.
He wants a challenge.
Right.
Like, it's not more food, not more meat. It's, what am I capable of? What is a worthy adversary for me to take down? If not a bear, then what, Buck? Like, I don't know what kind of hierarchy of the animal kingdom dogs have in their heads, but he clearly has one, and a bear was not enough.
Right. So apparently we find out what he was thinking was a giant bull moose. I guess that's more challenging than a bear because bears are more solitary, whereas the moose is traveling in a pack. And so not only does he have to kill the moose, but he has to sort of peel the moose off from the pack. So he targets this moose, kind of pulls him off. The other moose kind of get Buck away every once in a while, but eventually they give up, and Buck's got this large moose and he just wears him down. It says it takes 4 days that he chases this, and he really toys with him because there are probably moments where Buck could strike, but he's relishing this. He just sits and lets the moose rest, and he watches him. And then when the moose gets up, he starts messing with him again, just to completely wear this animal out.
He lets him rest, but he doesn't let him eat or drink. Anytime he tries to eat or drink anything, Buck is messing with him.
So Buck's kind of a jerk at this point.
I guess. I mean, if you're out to hunt or you're out for a kill, like, it's not really, I don't find the Buck thinks this Buck is the bull moose, is an enemy of any sort, but he is playing a game, and he's trying to find out what is he capable of. Physically, I think Buck knows he could he could kill the moose, but there's also like a mental game going on here.
He doesn't just want to kill the moose; he wants to completely dominate it.
Yeah, because the moose easily, if Buck were to make a mistake, the moose, one kick of his hoof would just obliterate Buck.
So Buck eventually
the moose has an arrow in him too, so he's slightly wounded,
right,
or at least in pain and angry.
Or it's a tough old moose. So not only that, has survived some things.
It's a good point too. It's a good point. Well, and eventually the herd gets fed up with it, and they're like, "Ugh,
go.
We just have to sacrifice one, and we can move on. We can get rid of this annoying guy. God, it's been 4 days.
It's a long time."
Yeah. So they leave the bull, which I guess is survival of the herd, because they could, Buck could be like, well, I'll just pick off a young one while I'm messing with this bull moose, and they could lose perhaps more than just the one. Right. So I guess the herd makes a difficult yet important decision.
So Buck eventually kills this moose, eats it, and then decides to head back home. But as he's going back, he's sensing something's not right on his way back.
And it's weird. Did you find it odd the way London wrote it? It was almost like, it was eerie because he wrote it with, I feel like, a positive lilt to it. There was life abroad in it, different from the life which had been there throughout the summer. Some subtle, mysterious way the birds talked of it, squirrels chattered. So it's like, it feels like just spring, like life anew when I was first reading it.
Or there's some gossip and he's just not in on it.
Oh, that's interesting. Like Disney movie where all the birds and dogs and everybody's twittering about something, but your main character doesn't know what's going on. Okay. But does say he was oppressed with a sense of calamity happening, if it were not calamity already happened. And as he's walking back towards, and he picks up a fresh trail, and the scent makes him bristle and ripple. And this is really the last straw in the call of the wild, so to speak, because Buck is a fully, there are not two Bucks after this incident.
Well, we had mentioned that John was the last thing sort of tethering him to civilization. Mm-hmm. Well, Buck gets back to camp and he finds everyone's dead. So he comes across Nidge is dead, Hans is dead, and realizes that some Indians have attacked, some local Canadian natives have attacked this camp and just killed everyone. And Buck just completely loses it at this point. He goes into a rage.
He pretty much decimates whatever, I don't know if the whole tribe is there, but the people who are there, he takes them out. Almost all of them.
Right. Scatters the rest, and they just take off. And this is Buck's final transformation. He is sad, but at the same time, he's kind of proud of himself. So he moved up from a bear to a moose, and now he's hit the apex predator. He's killed man. And
the noblest game of all.
And he's kind of shocked because he says it's harder to kill a husky dog than a man. So even though he's killed a man who he had feared since meeting the man in the red sweater and the club, and he realizes these guys are no big deal.
As long as they don't have weapons,
right?
They're weak.
He's fine with it.
Weak.
So John's dead, and Buck can now answer the call of the wild fully, and he runs off.
And I want to mention that the native tribe, the Yeehats, they're not an actual tribe. London made them up for the book.
Right. So I guess to his credit, he didn't pillory an actual tribe. He just made up a tribal name. I mean, I guess it is still racially insensitive that we're using natives as sort of the boogeymen, but I guess out in the wild, that would be your only adversary on a human level.
Yeah. And I never fault any story that has natives murdering white people. Never. I'm like, they deserve it.
Oh, who's the real
white people
savage?
Everywhere deserve it. That's probably not. What did you just say? What did you just say?
So John's dead. Buck runs off, and he finds a pack of wolves, and he gets into it. So it's kind of arrogant of him to think he's going to take on a full wolf pack.
But he does.
He does indeed.
He takes them on, kills a bunch of them, and then he sees his buddy, the one he spent a couple days running with, which I don't know why that guy didn't make introductions in the first place. Be like, no, he's cool, everyone. It was more like, I don't know him. And then after he kills a bunch of his pack, he's like, oh, hey, you want to touch noses?
Well, remember the wolf brother wanted to play and wanted to hang out with Buck, and Buck's like, nah, whatever, I'm going back. When he met him one-on-one.
Yeah, and he was disappointed.
He was like, it's a wolf, that's it. All right, whatever.
And so Buck not only becomes part of this pack, but apparently becomes the leader.
He becomes the leader and then becomes legend. So then
everyone is afraid of the ghost wolf.
The Yeehat name him the ghost dog, and he is, they notice. He's also, Buck's probably doing all right for himself because they also notice that the wolves in the area start to have different coloration, so...
Start looking a little St. Bernardish here and there.
Buck's not laying low with his pack. He's taking his responsibilities serious.
Yeah. It says the years were not many when the Yeehats noted a change in the breed of timber wolves. So Buck spends, we might spend, just a year from the time he's stolen to the time he's, or maybe a little over a year because he spends 3 seasons with Thornton, but he doesn't spend that long becoming this particular Buck. And now he's spending, this is it for him. This is the rest of his life. He becomes a stuff of legends.
And that's...
killing men, apparently.
Yeah. And that's...
May the tale grows worse.
What we all should be striving for, becoming legendary. All right, so that kind of finishes up Call of the Wild. I think what we'll do next week is have a sort of wrap-up summary discussion, and we'll discuss our next book and next reading. So tune in for that. Do you have any final thoughts for this episode, Mare?
I think just to marinate on like the book as a whole, and then coming back to the wrap-up discussion, like some of these overarching things about what happens when, not necessarily when nature calls, because that's a cliche phrase with stupid meanings, but what happens when life demands a different way of being, and can you go back or not? Like Buck doesn't go back. It's not like he's searching, could have gone another way, could have been the St. Bernard in him, and he could be searching for another Thornton in his life, but no, the wild wins out. And I just always find that the identification with our own lives, like how does that come up in literature like this? So that's what I'm going to be thinking about until our wrap-up discussion.
All right. Well, sounds good. So look for that in your feed next week. We'll finish up Call of the Wild and then reveal our next read.
Bum, bum, bum.
So if
Right.
you enjoy what we're doing here, then why don't you go over and rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts so that other literary folk can find us and rediscover classic literature. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at CYSTpod, and you can send us your thoughts over on our Facebook page, Classics You Slept Through, or via email, cystpod@gmail.com. So, until next time, this has been Classics You Slept Through. Please don't forget to shower after gym class, everyone.